This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more. Follow me.
Hi, welcome to the 90s and Beyond, a film podcast that looks at movies that came out, of course, during the 1990s, as well as movies that came out afterward that were sequels to, spin-offs from, or somehow had major influence from films that came out in the 1990s. My name is Vince Leo. I am a film critic. You could find all of my written work at my website, quipster.net, QWIPSTER.net. I've been doing film reviews actually since the middle of the 1990s, 1996 to be exact. So you can find over 4,000 of my written reviews at my website. I also encourage you, while you're there at the website, to check out the link that goes to my other podcast if you are also a fan of films that came out in the 1980s, because the other podcast that I do is called Around the World in 80s Movies. Find the link at quipster.net. Today I'm going to be getting into a film that kicked off pretty much a franchise, not only in films, but in video games and other media. It's called The Matrix. It came out in 1999, so right at the very tail end of the 90s. Of course, you don't need a lot of introduction if you know films of the 90s. You obviously know The Matrix. This was, as it was with Rocky for my 80s show, this was one of the more difficult films to do research on because the name Matrix has very different connotations, and it's been around a long time, and all of the sequels have the same title. So when I'm trying to do searches in libraries or in databases or anything like that, I keep encountering, not necessarily just the first film, but you get all of the films and you get every context of the word Matrix in every different kind of movie or even just in life. So it took a while to get through this, but hopefully you will find that it was worthwhile. And I do want to say, because you had waited quite a bit, I'm going to make this a double-length episode, just like I did for Rocky, because it's a culturally significant and very popular film, and there's a lot to talk about. So why don't we just begin? Of course, The Matrix, it is an R-rated film. It has violence. It does have a little bit of strong language. The runtime is 2 hours and 16 minutes. Keanu Reeves is the main star. Laurence Fishburne, Carrie-Anne Moss, Hugo Weaving, Joe Pantoliano, a bunch of other castmates as well in lesser roles. The directors and the screenwriters are Andy and Larry Wachowski. Now, obviously, they are known as Lana and Lily Wachowski today. And I have to make a choice here. Do I call them Andy and Larry Wachowski, which is what they were known as at the time that they made The Matrix, or do I retroactively call them Lana and Lily because that's who they are today? And I'm opting to call them Andy and Larry Wachowski, not for any kind of political reasons, but because their journey from going from Andy and Larry to Lana and Lily are going to be part of the Matrix saga as I cover them. So in looking at the films historically, I will also look at the filmmakers historically and go from who they were at the time to who they are today, and also look at how that affected their work at the time that they were doing it. So bear with me here. Whether I made the right decision or wrong decision, that is my rationale for saying Andy and Larry for at least this particular film. Now, the seeds for The Matrix were planted back in 1992. The sibling writing team, Andy and Larry Wachowski, they were offered their first ongoing comic book series. They were writing comics at the time. And they started with this ongoing series beginning with issue number 3 of a series called Ecto Kid, which was made for Clive Barker's Marvel Comics imprint called Razorline, which was coming out back in the early 1990s. And this particular title, Ecto Kid, it features a teenage protagonist And he's the son of a living human woman and a father who is a ghost. And when he hits puberty, he starts seeing the world as it exists with one eye, the world we all know, and with his other eye, he starts to see the world as a supernatural dimension that is full of ghosts and demons. And so Ecto-Kid takes to wearing an eye patch to try to keep his sanity because he can't see both at the same time. So he flips it from one eye to another, especially when he needs to traverse into the supernatural realm. He leaves his physical body behind to enter the supernatural realm that he sees with his other eye, and that body lays dormant in the mortal world. Now, during this time, an industry associate, a friend of theirs, asked them if they had any other ideas that they wanted to develop into a comic book series. And at that time, they really didn't have anything offhand, but they decided that they should do some brainstorming and come up with something. And they created this idea that they should do something like in the cyberpunk arena, like a cyberpunk science fiction that would be novel to American comics that felt very similar to a lot of their favorite comics, which happen to be Japanese manga, especially like Ghost in the Shell and Akira. They had the idea of exploring worlds within worlds, having written for Ecto-Kid. So they had this naturally on their mind. So they gravitated toward doing something that is like a virtual reality concept. And in their discussions of what they wanted to do, they discussed, well, what is the difference between virtual reality and reality? And they said reality is really just something that we perceive when our sensory organs, our ears and our eyes and our sense of touch and whatever, those just send electric impulses into our brains that we convert into feeling that we are sensing something real. But if humans are jacked into a virtual reality, a very detailed version of a virtual reality that is indistinguishable in the way it looks from our reality, then if our bodies are hooked up into this machine that could simulate those sensory impulses into our brain, we could very well confuse the virtual and the real. Further discussions, as they brainstormed, they turned this idea inside out, and they started wondering, well, what if the world we actually are living in, what if everything that we've done in life is actually being done in a virtual world? What if there were ultra-sophisticated computer-generated simulations going on that we were jacked into, and everything that we are perceiving is some sort of digital artifact with sensory properties that stimulate responses in our remote bodies that we interpret as real sensory things? And furthermore, what if somebody woke up to that fact? If they knew they were in a virtual reality that was being conducted by ultra-sophisticated computers, what if they were a skillful cyberpunk hacker who awakens to this and then has the ability to begin altering the program's coding to make him or her have superhero qualities within this virtual environment? Now, around this time, all of these concepts were very much being thought of because during the 1990s, the internet was flourishing and there were a lot of people that started entering cyberspace. We all started assuming new identities. We gave ourselves cool nicknames, and our avatars or our online selves were really our idealized selves. While 1990s computers were too primitive to create a realistic virtual world at the time, maybe computers in the far future could. Artificial intelligence could also, by that time, become sentient enough to dominate humanity into some sort of subservience. It would be sophisticated to the point where if computers started thinking for themselves, they probably would think that humans should be unnecessary, and that they might place us into this artificial simulation that is so intricate we easily confuse it for reality. As they started continuing to come up with original ideas of why computers would do such a thing, they started cranking music by Ministry, by Rage Against the Machine, very popular at the time. That music that gave them the energy and inspiration to keep going. They put all of their ideas into these legal notepads. Everything that they could think of, they designed all kinds of new intricacies to their rationale. Why AI would keep humanity alive while jacked into this virtual reality existence. And they came up with this idea that computers might use human bodies that were stored in massive power grids, like batteries for energy to sustain themselves when other sources of energy became impossible to obtain. Maybe humans were rebelling against the AI and the computers and destroyed their sources for generating power, like blocking out the sun. But human bodies are finite. They don't last long, and they last even less, the computers have come to find out, without some sort of mental stimulation. So the computers have to create this virtual simulation of life for the humans to live through, living blissfully ignorant of their enslavement as just cells in a giant battery field. Now, a few humans do know the truth. Some have never been captured. They're still living in this hidden underground city. And some are freed rebels, people who were once jacked into the virtual reality that were freed by others who were freed by others. And they're sent to try to recruit more to try to ultimately take on rebelling against the AI overlords. Transitioning to the real world, though, presents kind of a challenge because leaving behind the comfortable simulated world to live in this much more dangerous and dour and horrifying real world is not something that many humans want to do, they come to find out. And those who are ultimately selected to become rebels start their training and they cultivate advanced technical abilities to do things that were thought impossible, at least in the virtual world. And the AI overlords start creating powerful super agents to traverse into the virtual reality environments to snuff out these rebels who are doing these incredible things while in the virtual world. The Wachowskis dubbed this virtual world the Matrix, and they called it that after a phrase that was coined in cyberpunk legend William Gibson's Sprawl trilogy, representing data paths within virtual reality. They borrowed also Gibson's notion that humans could have skills uploaded into their minds. For instance, if they wanted to learn how to fly a helicopter, they could just upload that coding into their virtual selves, and their virtual selves, at the very least, would learn how to fly that helicopter. And they love this idea because now, with this idea, they could inject every cultural obsession they could imagine into this comic book story. This story could go almost anywhere, literally almost anywhere that they wanted it to go. The Wachowskis didn't view The Matrix necessarily at the time as a commentary on technology. They were seeing it much more as a metaphor for systems. Systems that tell you what to think and you can't really question them. Systems like governments, or religion, or corporations, or other powerful institutions where humans habitually hand over their consciousness to these predetermined systems. And so the Matrix's theme at the time was awakening humanity to evolve beyond these systems to find power within ourselves. Now, in reality, the Wachowskis were also evolving as writers. Comic books alone really wasn't something that was going to pay their bills. They were still hustling side jobs. They were house painters. They were carpenters around Chicago, trying to stay afloat financially. They read a book that came out in 1990 by Roger Corman called How I Made 100 Movies in Hollywood and Never Lost a Dime. And so, inspired by this book, they began pouring their efforts not into comics, but into screenplays. And their first screenplay was this very Corman-esque horror premise about eating the rich, and it was called Carnivore. Now, the idea for Carnivore, if they wanted to make this into a film, it was too expensive to make themselves. So they reached out to 10 talent agencies from an agent handbook that accepted unsolicited scripts. Now, the query letter that they sent to these 10 talent agencies did earn them interest from 2, and eventually it led down to their eventual agent that represented them, Lawrence Mattis. After reading the script for Carnivore, Mattis did encourage them to write something much more commercially appealing, because that was going to be a hard sell. Studios at the time, in the early to mid-1990s, were shelling out millions for broad appeal action-based screenplays, and they were even giving millions to people who had no prior writing experience. The Wachowskis continued to work on other screenplay concepts, and their next script did sell, called Assassins, which was about a veteran hitman stalked by a younger hitman. It sold for $1 million to Dino De Laurentiis, who then sold it for like $5 million to Warner Brothers. However, once Assassins did get made, they hated all of the changes that were made to it by a screenwriter that was hired by director Richard Donner, Brian Helgeland, he was commissioned against their wishes because the studio wanted to broaden the appeal by removing a lot of the subtext and the nuance and the dark-edged bleakness they felt was getting in the way that was in the script. In so doing, the Wachowskis were incensed enough to actually demand that their names be taken off of the credits, calling this an abortion of their original story. But they were talked out of it. Actually, they couldn't legally remove their name because apparently they found out that they made too much money in the screenplay to actually take their name off of it. So they continued doing some work for hire. While they were performing a rewrite of Unforgettable, another film for Dino De Laurentiis, the Wachowskis began transforming their Matrix comic book concept into a screenplay idea. Now, it had a lot of action genre possibilities within it, but they felt that The Matrix as a premise could make an action film that was intelligent and socially relevant, not just these assembly line shootouts and car chases that were very predominant in the early 1990s. They felt especially that Hong Kong action films in the 1990s were blowing away anything that Hollywood was putting out in terms of excitement and blending its action directly into the narrative. And they thought it would absolutely blow American audiences away to see Hollywood actors doing all of the kinds of acrobatic fighting that you would see Jet Li do in those Hong Kong movies. So they injected a kung fu premise within The Matrix as part of its underpinning. So they started, in addition to kung fu, they borrowed from a lot of their favorite influences, especially cinematic influences, John Woo, other Hong Kong filmmakers at the time, but also classic, very mainstream filmmakers like Stanley Kubrick, especially his 2001: A Space Odyssey, and that use of monoliths as symbols. They wanted to have a lot of symbolic things going on within the Matrix. They loved John Huston and Billy Wilder, Ridley Scott, George Lucas, and Fritz Lang. So they borrowed a lot of things that they liked from those auteurs, as well as Jean-Luc Godard's Alphaville. That was another major influence. Now, the early draft for what would become The Matrix features a very action-packed prologue where we meet a character named Eddie. And Eddie is a new rebel recruit who gets captured while in The Matrix after he tries to visit his girlfriend, Christy, who is still living in The Matrix, one last time. After that prologue, we find a teenage hacker named Neo, and he becomes the next rebel recruit from the rebel leader named Morpheus. Neo is specifically selected because he doesn't have the vulnerability that Eddie had of being in love at the time. After swallowing a pill that allows him to distinguish between the Matrix and reality, Neo is subsequently kidnapped and then interrogated by a super agent named Agent Smith. When Neo refuses to cooperate, Morpheus reveals that interaction was just a simulation, and Neo has passed the initiation, and he can begin his training as one of the rebel forces. Now, uploads into Neo's mind start giving him immense fighting skills as well as deeper knowledge, and Neo learns that the mission is to help the human resistance bring down these cyber marines being these RoboCop-like soldiers that ended up going rogue at some point in history. They took over the world and eradicated most of humanity except for ones that were hiding in the subterranean base called Zion. When the Cybermarines began running out of energy, they started farm-breeding humans, hooking them up to their energy grid, and engaging their minds by jacking them into this virtual reality simulation of the world as it existed between the years 1989 and 2009. It was just in a constant loop of those 20 years. After you got to 2009, it just kind of rebooted. The climax finds Morpheus captured by Agent Smith, who is then revealed as a cybermarine in disguise while in the Matrix. Smith uses a truth serum to get Morpheus to reveal Zion's location. Morpheus's top warrior named Trinity intends to save humanity by launching electronics destroying electromagnetic impulse missiles. It would be at the cost of Morpheus's life, though. And Neo determines that, he has the time, he thinks, to rescue Morpheus before the missiles hit. So then it ends with the major action sequence culminating in the missiles destroying the Cybermarines while Neo, who has managed to rescue Morpheus, Neo begins kissing Trinity because they have an ongoing flirtation throughout the story. And then Morpheus realizes, seeing this, that love maybe isn't so bad after all. That was kind of The Matrix as it existed in 1994 in one of the early concept screenplays. The Wachowskis had been shopping the script for The Matrix around, but few that they gave this script to understood the concept to even begin to figure out what was going on. Producer Joel Silver, he had his team at Silver Pictures. They dissected what they could out of this Matrix premise, and they deemed it kind of a Terminator knockoff. But they did enjoy the first act, at least before it settles into some very bizarre and confusing virtual reality things that were going on in this realm that, to them, read more like an artsy, philosophical sci-fi novel like Frank Herbert's Dune than it did a movie. But Silver, who was one of the producers on Assassins, he took it up because he knew that the Wachowskis were talented enough to fix what wasn't working. The Wachowskis, who were still very much upset with what happened with Assassins, even though Silver was a producer on that, they forgave him because at the time, he did try to advocate for them, even though he was ultimately unsuccessful in keeping the changes that the studio wanted from getting made. Now, they didn't want to see the same thing that happened to Assassins happen to The Matrix. And so they sold to Silver only on condition that they were going to be the directors themselves. In February of 1994, Warner outbid Universal Pictures for The Matrix. The Wachowskis would receive another $1 million for their script, as well as being on the hook for additional rewrites. Warner production president at the time, Lorenzo di Bonaventura, he understood The Matrix's concepts pretty well for somebody who was one of the execs, but he did conclude, very much like Silver Pictures, that it needed major changes to become a viable script for the big screen. So revisions would have to be made, and each revision by the Wachowskis built layers into their mythology. For allusions, they reread Homer's The Odyssey. That happened to be their favorite book of all time. They also began reading a lot of philosophy at the time, and they started putting in ideas by Karl Marx and Kafka and Schopenhauer, and Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland became kind of a recurring motif. Plato's The Cave, which kind of involves the choosing to live in blissful ignorance instead of an uncertain reality. René Descartes, his evil demon from Meditation on First Philosophy, that everything is an illusion or deception designed to enslave us. Buddhism, quantum physics, the Bible, especially in its Christ allegory, it was all of these illusions to give a lot of subtext to everything that was going on in the story. Now, unfortunately, each time that they added a new layer, a new philosophical wrinkle to the story, it only sank the film further with the Warner executives who didn't see like the concept of what they were going for to begin with, and laying all of these extra layers on top of it, they felt were going to lose the audience. And the Wachowskis might, in their own minds, have a very crystal clear vision of everything that they intended to do, but it wasn't clear to somebody who was just reading the script and all of these bare bones descriptions. So they brought them in for in-person meetings to try to discuss what it was they were trying to achieve at Warner Brothers. And they started verbally explaining, going through the script page by page, mouthing out sound effects, but it still was not getting the concepts across to these Warner execs. Around this time, the DVD of Ghost in the Shell was released, and the Wachowskis were very enthused about this, and they showed it to Joel Silver, and they said, we want to do that for real. That's exactly what they were going for with The Matrix. And when Silver saw this, he understood better after watching the anime, and the Wachowskis realized that if Silver could get that from watching this video, which wasn't The Matrix, but it was similar, the only way that Warner executives probably would understand what they were going for with The Matrix was if they were going to see it for themselves. And that was a line that they would use in the movie. Recognizing that films are a visual medium, the Wachowskis felt that Warner execs might understand if the script contained illustrations all along the way. So they contacted comic book industry friends, including fellow Chicagoan Jeff Darrow, who did a comic that was popular at the time called Hard Boiled, to come in and hand draw the script into storyboards. And they would also enlist assistance from Ecto Kids illustrator Steve Scroce, as well as do some conceptual design art from Tani Kunitake. Together, all of these artists produced over 700 color and monochromatic storyboards, equating to about a 400-page graphic novel made into two 11 by 17 book glyphs, so that the Warner executives could read that and understand the story from beginning to end using those visuals. Now, visualizing what they couldn't before, the studio executives actually started expressing renewed interest in making The Matrix, They requested for an introduction to be attached to their script, so that would explain the plot beforehand, so that they could attract maybe getting some talented leading actors to put into the film. Now, Warner was still skeptical about letting the Wachowskis direct, so they allowed them to do something outside of Warner, another screenplay that they had sold, again, to Dino De Laurentiis, a $3 million kinky lesbian thriller called Bound. And when Bound, it was very stylish, very suspenseful, critically and commercially successful. Warner conceded that the Wachowskis did have the directorial talent to take on The Matrix. Unfortunately, though, there was some bad timing here because Warner was experiencing a very prolonged run of expensive flops, and they only were going to greenlight The Matrix to be made into a movie if they made it for well under what the Wachowskis felt was the minimum needed. And that left it in limbo yet again. So to offset costs for a lot of their future productions, Warner started entering into rights-splitting deals with other studios, including this 20-picture deal with Australia's Village Roadshow Pictures. Warner finally consented to let the Wachowskis direct The Matrix if they agreed that they would make it in Australia and perform another pass on the script to reduce a lot of the budgetary elements that were still considered to be too costly. Now, with the Australian exchange rate being 62 cents to the American dollar, they were going to shave an estimated 30% off of whatever the production price would have been in Hollywood. So, and on top of this, they were going to garner an additional $12 million in tax incentive returns. So there was a lot more bang for the buck, and they might be getting a lot more bucks back before the film was even released. Producer Barry Osborne, he was very experienced with doing Australian productions. He was contacted by Silver to help the Wachowskis get this off the ground. One of the first things that Osborne did was locate Hong Kong kung fu film choreographer extraordinaire Yuen Wu-ping and got him in contact with the Wachowskis, who wanted him very desperately to choreograph the kung fu action in The Matrix. Although Wu-ping liked the script, he didn't really want to commit so much time to making just one movie, so he asked for an exorbitant fee in order to discourage future discussions. Surprisingly, though, the Wachowskis and Warner accepted Wu-ping's price. Wu-ping, though, made further demands. He demanded complete control of the choreography, and he wanted the actors to engage in months of conditioning, wire harness training, and then he would do all of the choreography with the actors so that they could appear to leap and fly and run on walls in ways that would defy known physics. The main actors would have to undergo 6 months of exercise regimen alone, and then 4 months of martial arts training within this room with padded walls and floors until they felt fully comfortable with the process to be able to do it real in front of the camera. As far as casting goes, for Neo, Johnny Depp was the Wachowskis' top choice at the time, but his schedule at that time was not going to allow it. Warner really pushed hard to get Brad Pitt, but Pitt was too exhausted after making 7 years in Tibet to do another exhausting film. Leonardo DiCaprio, similarly, he had several discussions before opting out because he also had just done an effects-heavy film, Titanic, and he didn't want to do another one. Will Smith, he came in. He was initially very intrigued, but as the Wachowskis started talking to him, he thought that they were a little nuts, and their pitch for their movie was off-putting, and all of the explanations for wire fu seemed very nonsensical and things like they could never really pull off into a movie. Smith thought also the screenplay should have a lot more humor, maybe another love interest, but the Wachowskis refused to make any of these changes, so he decided he was going to do another film that he was interested in doing at the time called Wild Wild West, of course, one of the mega turkeys of the 90s. Nicolas Cage turned it down. He didn't want to be away from his family so long in Australia. Lou Diamond Phillips was among the many actors who received a screenplay, but the agent advised him to turn it down because it was going to be a guaranteed flop, he thought. Tom Cruise, Kevin Costner, Ewan McGregor, I mean, you can name like dozens of other names at the time that were reportedly considered for the role at one time or another, but they had a really hard time getting any male leads really interested because of the time commitment involved, as well as being away from home in Australia for, a couple years, and have to undergo so much training just to be in it, that they felt that they needed to expand their horizons even and see, maybe even Neo could be a female. So they reached out to Sandra Bullock, who had done Demolition Man for Silver as well as Warner. And she was also an early contender for the Trinity role to see if she was interested in being the lead role, but she wasn't in the lead role or even with Trinity at the time. Sometime later, she was offered Trinity, and at the time, the male lead was not somebody she was interested in working with. So when Keanu Reeves was ultimately suggested, the Wachowskis were hesitant, but they were willing to be open to it because they knew him mostly for his comedic and romantic roles. They really couldn't see him in that role for some reason. And his acting in action films, some of those action films seemed borderline absurd. Even Speed, which was a very successful film, seemed to them kind of the kind of action movie they weren't trying to make. Reeves himself also had qualms because his prior effort in the realm of cyberpunk, a film called Johnny Mnemonic, it had bombed big at the box office, and he felt that was probably not going to be a good thing for him to do another one. But he was personally a comic book fan, so he loved the Matrix conceptual storyboards when he did get to see them. And he also enjoyed reading a lot of the philosophical aspects. He also, was a devotee of kung fu movies, so he found a lot of the content was very favorable. As he read the script, he very much identified with Neo's feeling that things were off in his life, that he didn't really trust the world, and he liked the monastic search for truth because it was something that he himself was going through at the time. After meeting Keanu, the Wachowskis' hesitation quickly dissipated because they felt that he had this external boyish innocence to him, but there was an internal grounded maturity beyond that, and they felt that was going to provide a key aspect to Neo's character, that he would be an innocent at the beginning, and his more mature side would become more grounded as the story developed. Reeves eventually did sign on for nearly $10 million. Now, about 20 actresses at one time or another were under consideration for the role of Trinity. The desired qualities for Trinity were beauty, athleticism, a commitment to the role, as well as a toughness to endure months of laborious training sessions. And the actress chosen would also have to be somebody who could express emotional vulnerability underneath that toughness. Trinity also had to seem enigmatic because audiences shouldn't come in with any preconceived notions as to whether Trinity, as we see here at the beginning, was actually a threat or maybe an ally. Now, among those who auditioned was Janet Jackson, but Janet Jackson had commitments to her Velvet Rope tour. She wasn't going to be able to get away for that long to make this movie. On the same day that Janet came in to talk to the Wachowskis, Gabrielle Union came in, and she was dressed pretty much exactly like Janet Jackson in terms of wardrobe, and she wore this weave and makeup, and ultimately she was not deemed good enough for the role. Salma Hayek, she lost out because the physical requirements of the role were too much. She was just too lazy to hit the gym, she says. Rosie Perez totally bombed her audition. I mean, she just did not understand the concept or what she was supposed to do, and eventually she was shown the door. Jada Pinkett was somebody who actually did very well and was being seriously considered for Trinity at the time. But when she started doing screen tests with Keanu Reeves, they determined that she just lacked that kind of romantic chemistry with Reeves that was very much needed for Trinity. Canadian actress Carrie-Anne Moss was not somebody at all on their early radar. She was mostly a television actress in Canada, so somebody that the Wachowskis really hadn't heard of, but one of the TV shows on her resume did catch the Wachowskis' eye. She was on this very short-lived show called Matrix. So she came in and she did 3-hour-long auditions with the Kung Fu trainers, and then ultimately a screen test with Reeves where she exuded a natural chemistry with him. Now, she was a relative unknown still, but the Wachowskis did want her to be enigmatic, so they concluded that this enhanced Trinity's requirements. Despite no prior fight training, Moss exuded a certain intensity and a presence enough to look like she could deliver a punch. Now, Moss, when she was auditioning, she didn't really understand the film's concept, but in the way that the Wachowskis described it to her, she viewed Trinity as representing faith and belief, and so that gave her the motivation to find for her character. After she was selected, she started watching Clint Eastwood films and noticed in his performances where he exhibited a lot of inner strength, but also a quiet intensity, and she wanted to give that to the character of Trinity. Now, for Morpheus, Warner initially pursued Arnold Schwarzenegger, who had coincidentally played John Matrix in Commando for Joel Silver, as well as Michael Douglas. Both of them declined, though. Russell Crowe declined. He was given the script, but he lost interest with the premise, like 40-some pages into reading the script. He didn't understand the world or its concept. Gary Oldman also didn't like the concept when he heard it, and to this day, when he's asked about The Matrix, he doesn't even recall being asked about it. It was just something he didn't even bother thinking about for very long. Chow Yun-fat, he was offered the role. It declined to do the Collector. Samuel L. Jackson was under consideration, but he couldn't commit the time. The Wachowskis, on a fluke, they met Laurence Fishburne while they were in Las Vegas in 1997. They were attending the boxing rematch between Mike Tyson and Evander Holyfield. And when they were talking to Fishburne, they liked his very deep, very commanding voice in person. And they felt like he had the kind of gravitas, the kind of stature that would be required for somebody like Morpheus. So they really pushed for Fishburne. The studio, though, Warner, pushed back, saying that Fishburne, he lacked a name recognition outside of the United States. They thought maybe Sean Connery or Val Kilmer or somebody like that had more international appeal would be a better choice. So they reached out to them first. Connery declined. He couldn't make any sense of the script. While Val Kilmer, he lost out after insisting that Morpheus should become the lead character instead of Neo, which the Wachowskis were not going to do. After they secured Keanu Reeves, they had their international star, so Warner allowed Fishburne, and as a lover of science fiction, Fishburne eagerly accepted the role. He felt that the script was very well thought out, had a very fascinating premise. He understood the concept on first read, didn't need the storyboards. He didn't even understand why others were confused about it. But he accepted the role knowing that such a smart film like this was unlikely to be made by Hollywood in the end. So he was cautiously optimistic. In preparation for the role of Morpheus, the Wachowskis encouraged Fishburne to read their inspiration for the character, Neil Gaiman's comic series Sandman, for how to play Morpheus. The main character is called Morpheus in the Sandman comic, and of course all of this from the Greek god of sleep and dreams, Morpheus. Fishburne happened to have a set of the Sandman comics that were given to him by DC Comics head Jeanette Kahn while they were on a flight together. For Agent Smith, the Wachowskis' choice of Jean Reno, that didn't quite pan out because Jean Reno also was one of those actors who did not want to be away from France or his family for so long. So because they wanted the production to start soon, they decided, well, let's find somebody who is not going to have to be away from their family by doing an Australian film. So they went with looking at Australian actors, and they ultimately determined Hugo Weaving should be who they pursued. The Wachowskis really enjoyed his work in the film called Proof. They also viewed his work in Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, and they really liked him in those roles, in those films. So Weaving was hired. He developed Agent Smith's very menacing manner of speaking by mimicking the way the Wachowskis spoke, kind of as a joke. So as he started doing the role, kind of mimicking the Wachowskis, he was surprised when they loved it and wanted him to keep doing it for that particular role. Now, Weaving was unsure how to play an AI character, but the Wachowskis said that Agent Smith's programming, as well as all of the other super agents, they were created to maintain control. So they have a very limited emotional state, but it depended on how well they achieved control. They would be happy if they had control, or they would be very angry and frustrated if they didn't have control. So he could play emotions, but within that very limited scope. Village Roadshow's Queensland studios, that proved too small to make The Matrix, so they opted for Fox's new studios in Sydney. They could also perform location shoots around Sydney because it looked like many cities in America. It had a very dense and diverse architecture that would work very well for any kind of city. The City Council of Sydney, New South Wales government, as well as other local authorities offered to let the film production use the streets and buildings normally off limits because the production was going to bring approximately $20 million, Australian dollars, to the city and the businesses of Sydney. So it was worthwhile to let them shoot there. Rushes were sent via ISDN for the Hollywood execs to make comments on the digital footage using kind of this form of electronic post-it notes. And then that was sent back to Sydney to be reviewed before the next day of shooting. As they continued to work on revisions, the Wachowskis ended up adding the role of Cypher in later drafts, specifically for Joe Pantoliano. Pantoliano happened to work with the Wachowskis. He did a very bold and memorable character performance in Bound. They liked working with him. Now, Pantoliano found the script himself. He found it incomprehensible. But he rationalized he only really needed to rehearse the scenes that he was in, and he wasn't in most of the movie. So he could make it work for the limited amount of time he was on the screen. The largest hurdle, though, was his character. Because he was in the real world, he had to look somewhat scrawny, emaciated, which meant that Pantoliano had to stop drinking. He had to start eating steamed vegetables. He had to work out constantly to try to keep his weight down to very gaunt. Even with a personal trainer urging him through thousands of crunches every day, Pantoliano could not lose his gut and fit into the leather pants he was supposed to fit into. So he decided he's going to skip all of the agony, all of the crunches every day that was not helping, and just undergo liposuction. So he underwent liposuction. He sent the $7,800 medical bill to Warner. De Bonaventura laughed at this when he saw it. He said Pantoliano was crazy to think that Warner was going to pay for this unauthorized cosmetic procedure that Pantoliano was going to benefit from in all of his future roles. Pantoliano glibly retorted that, well, it sounds like Warner was only going to pay if he injected his fat back into his belly, apparently. In Excess's Michael Hutchence was cast in an unspecified major role as an ally to Neo. But after he was cast, he committed suicide days later, and the role was removed. Madonna also reportedly turned down an unspecified role, something she deeply regretted years later after feeling that The Matrix was one of the best films she'd ever seen. The role of Switch was meant to be portrayed by a man in real life and then a woman in The Matrix. But Warner felt that this change was too confusing, so she remained a female character in both. I'd like to think that maybe Hutchence was supposed to be the male version of that ended up getting cut out, but I have no proof of that. The main actors were required to do certain reading so that they could have an understanding of the basic concepts behind The Matrix. Jean Baudrillard's 1981 book, Simulacra and Simulation, which related how reality is shaped by symbols. That book actually makes kind of a cameo appearance in the movie as a hollowed out book where Neo stashes his illegal wares in the scene where we meet Neo in his apartment. Baudrillard, unfortunately for the Wachowskis, Baudrillard came out and he panned The Matrix. He called it a distortion of his philosophies that is more a byproduct of a Matrix than an antidote to one. The desert of the real in the film is a quote that's paraphrased from Baudrillard. It also describes true Earth in which a genuine landscape withers and becomes desert-like as the inhabitants obsess over a giant map instead. The Wachowskis had a lot of back history in their minds as to what went into Morpheus' presentation to Neo in that desert of the real scene. They hoped eventually that they could make an anime prequel relating to an adventure of the first person who was going to be called The One. And they also thought, well, maybe a Matrix video game could coincide with the release of any sequels. Now, Baudrillard wasn't the only thing they had to read. They also had to read Kevin Kelly's Out of Control, The New Biology of Machines, Social Systems, and the Electronic World, and Dylan Evans and Oscar Zarate's Evolutionary Psychology. So the Wachowskis could explain all of the philosophical aspects of the plot to the main actors so that they fully understood their motivation. Before training began, though, Reeves underwent neck surgery to correct this degenerative spinal injury from this old motorcycle accident that had resulted in some fused vertebrae, sparking frequent tingling in the area, as well as intermittent motor loss to his legs that caused him to lose balance and fall down occasionally. Reeves did not mention that injury during the auditions because he feared he would lose the role, but he did see his doctor, and his doctor diagnosed him with spinal stenosis, and he recommended surgery before he was going to undertake this role because of the physical requirements. The damaged discs were removed, and then a plate was placed into his neck that would allow him to resume training as long as he wore a neck brace. The cast trained for 3 months while in Los Angeles and then in Australia for 1. Wu Ping's team blessed the set with a Buddhist ceremony. They roasted a pig and everything. And Wu Ping refused to be bound by the storyboards, choreographing what happens, mostly based on the actors' individual physical talents. He pushed them to do the best that they could physically, and whatever their assets were, he incorporated into the choreography. Each day began with 90 minutes of stretching, kicking, punching for another 90, and then hours of wire work choreography. The wear and tear on the actors was substantial. They could barely get out of bed most days. An insurance person was on site to monitor Keanu Reeves just to make sure that he didn't do anything he shouldn't. And a lot of the riskier moments required calling Keanu's doctor to sign off clearance before he could proceed with doing the shoot. Keanu himself, though, was in constant state of fear that he would do a wrong move and that could cause permanent damage. So he wasn't allowed to perform kicks until he felt fully recovered. They postponed a lot of his action scenes until further in the shoot, using stunt doubles for action that were requiring him experiencing any kind of bodily impact. Reeves wasn't the only person with injuries. 2 days into training, Hugo Weaving suffered a femur injury where a polyp in his hip was discovered that needed surgical removal, and that required 6 weeks of recuperation and moving also his fight scenes toward the end of production. Moss injured her ankle while she was rehearsing cartwheeling into a wall during the government lobby scene. The set nurse advised her to stop immediately, but Moss persevered, fearing very much like Keanu that her role was going to get recast if she said that she had a sprained ankle. So after nailing the somersault in further rehearsals, she screamed out a loud F-bomb to cope through all of the pain she had experienced going through all of that on her bum ankle. Now, for the film's overall aesthetic, the Wachowskis wanted to contrast the two distinct worlds, the virtual and the real. The virtual world, they wanted it to look bright but very commonplace. The skies were white and it had unappealing textures, plus a very pervasive green tint that resembled the phosphorus look of CRT monitor screens at the time. The real world, where humans haven't manufactured things in many years, it should look grimy, very cold and rusty and dilapidated. They employed a blue tint to emphasize that this was a real world environment not found in the Matrix. Scenes taking place in training simulations have more of a yellow tint. Costume designer Kim Barrett envisioned the Matrix as a shadowy, illusionary realm with stealthy people who could disappear and reappear as whims. So the wardrobe emphasized that kind of stealthiness, slickness, contrast, a lot of reflective qualities. Costumes were designed for maximum movement and space because the actors and stunt people had to wear harnesses and safety padding for all of that wire and stunt work. The costume budget was very tight, though, so Trinity's costume is very inexpensive PVC. Neo's coat was made from a cheap synthetic wool blend because the Wachowskis wanted it to billow and float in a way that leather just wasn't going to do. Because of the religious connotations of from various cultures about the search for the one, which was Neo, Neo's wardrobe incorporated like cassocks with accents from Japanese samurai and ancient Chinese warriors. And the agents were specifically modeled after the Secret Service from the Kennedy era because they were kind of like Secret Service protecting the Matrix at all costs. Barrett contrasted the virtual world with its very sterile look with the real world with its handmade organic fabrics. She actually had them made by mothers and grandmothers in a knitting circle to give it that they had to make the clothing on their own look. Thomas Anderson's shabby, ill-fitting clothes that we see in The Matrix are meant to suggest that he doesn't belong in that world and that he always looks like he's just waking up, which was part of his character. Long trench coats were worn by a lot of the rebels in The Matrix. That was meant to cover their weaponry. Neo originally was meant to don army fatigues, but then they changed that to all black when the Wachowskis decided that they wanted to emulate Frank Miller's comic, very popular in the 90s, called Sin City, and its bleak, monochromatic black and white contrasts. The custom-made cyberpunk-inspired sunglasses, those were done by Blind Design Project. These sunglasses were also functional because they provided the actors extra protection during a lot of the action sequences that had flying debris. You know, the producers initially thought they would just go to Sunglass Hut and find some sunglasses, but Barrett felt that the rebels, in addition to making their own clothes, they would have to make their own sunglasses, so each pair would only fit them, so it had to be very custom made. Early in the production, Warner accused the Wachowskis of proceeding too slowly for their tastes, and they started threatening the Wachowskis that they were going to cut certain scenes to make sure that the film was completed on time. Now, the Wachowskis said that the movie was not going to work without those scenes that they wanted to cut. And if they wanted to actually cut those scenes, they would need to find somebody else to finish the film because they weren't going to be there. And given that the Wachowskis were the only ones who really understood how to make the movie, they had the clout to actually get their way. In this case, the Wachowskis did, though, have to prove a little something. So they had The Matrix's editor, Zack Steinberg, put together one of those scenes that the Warner was going to cut, the opening actioner that features Trinity. They put it together with some temp sound effects and then sent it to Warner. And Warner liked it so much that afterward they left the Wachowskis alone. They even approved double the visual effects. And they increased the shoot length from 90 days to 118 to get every scene that they wanted into the film. The government lobby scene, the famous shootout toward the climax of this film, this was originally going to be not a government lobby, but a hotel brimming with people. But this changed when the original concept of superguns, because the agents were going to be using these tranquilizer needles and these very oddly fashioned guns, they thought that was going to be too costly to produce. So they decided to go with regular M16s. But of course, that would mean that innocent bystanders might get killed. So they decided to have a building that was not with any innocent bystanders, although you could argue that the cops or the guards that are killed in the scenes are actually innocent. But Trinity was also supposed to use more martial arts in the scenes. She was supposed to throw knives. She was supposed to have a bolo. But the setups for all of that took too long, and it slowed the action, they felt. So they kept it almost entirely with guns. As for Moss, the chemistry that she has with Keanu was not necessarily all acting. She was smitten by Keanu while she was making this film. She even told friends that she was in love. Not only was Keanu gorgeous, but he was also very brainy. He was romantic. He was sensitive in all the best ways. Despite having mutual flirtation, Reeves never did ask Carrie-Anne Moss out, at least until Laurence Fishburne took charge and arranged a dinner date for them. Afterward, they actually got very close. They took a 5-day trip to India for this music convention that was featuring Dog Star, which is Keanu Reeves' band at the time. However, the relationship between Reeves and Moss never really manifested beyond mutual attraction because Keanu was at that time involved with Jennifer Syme, who was pregnant with his child. His child, unfortunately, would later be stillborn. The shoot in Australia did have its downsides. The Australian press was especially also taken with Keanu, maybe not in the romantic way, but they had a newspaper column called Keanu Watch that published everything that he did. Whatever he ate in restaurants, whatever he purchased in stores, it was all fodder for informing the public. Things turned sour when Keanu's attempts at maintaining privacy, which was hard to do, including declining autograph seekers, resulted in him getting negative stories in the press that painted him as very standoffish and obnoxious. And it just had a lot of negative press. Reeves needed respite from all of this. You know, he would go off and fly to the U.S. whenever possible, either to play with his band, Dog Star, or to visit his ailing sister, Kim. The human farm, the power plant scene where all the humans are being put into cells in order to be used for energy, that was the last to be shot because it did require Keanu to lose 15 pounds as well as shave his entire body bald. So they waited to the very end of the shoot to do this. Unfortunately, Keanu's avoidance of the food tent where the cast typically ate in favor of spending time with the stunt crew and the Hong Kong team increased his standoffish reputation behind the cameras as well. So Reeves spent 4 hours in makeup every morning to put all of the jacks onto his body, and then the rest of the day laying in this freezing vat of goo, waiting for doing his acting for the scenes. The silver lining to the new look, the emaciated look, was that Keanu Reeves was no longer getting recognized while he was out in public because he was bald and very thin. But the downside came when Keanu next appeared publicly with Dog Star while they were performing in Los Angeles because all of the celebrity gossip ran rampant that Keanu was somehow suffering from sort of disease or maybe he was on drugs, and more negative press followed him because of The Matrix. John Gaeta, he was the visual effects director. His company, Mass Illusions, aka Mannix, they developed a system called Flow-Mo, which the Wachowskis later dubbed, famously, Bullet Time Photography. Bullet Time was particularly inspired by the Japanese animation style of freezing a character in action, and then the camera kind of dollies or zooms around them. The Wachowskis specifically pointed to the intro titles and one of their favorite TV shows, the animated TV show Speed Racer. Of course, they did a movie version of Speed Racer later, but in the intro titles to Speed Racer, Speed exits his car, he freezes mid-stride, and then the camera pans around him, and that gave them the inspiration that they wanted to do that for action scenes in The Matrix. They were originally looking at it, building this rocket camera that they would shoot, and it would move about 100 miles per hour, and that would film in slow motion, but it would produce the desired effect when they put it into normal speed. But Gaeta felt that this was very unsafe to do, but he remembered there was a similar technique that was used in some music videos that were done by Michel Gondry. They should try that out, and it actually worked very well. The technology employed nearly 100 still cameras that would be along the path of pre-filmed and pre-scanned action. Single frame shots are taken of the actors and moving objects as they go along this path, and then the photos that are taken by all of the cameras are scanned into a computer that virtually fills in all of the missing moments between the shots to give the seamless flow of the actors as well as the objects. The footage can then be displayed at any speed that they want to, from super slow-mo to hyper fast, and all of that would take about 16 days to render just a 30-second shot. When the film was finally completed, test screenings, of course, Warner absolutely loved the film. The only thing that they requested changed at all was that it was just 10 minutes too long. So they wanted to find a way to actually reduce the time. They didn't care what was taken out, as long as they reduced the time. The Wachowskis did go back to the editing room, and they took out about 5.5 minutes. Warner didn't even bother to look at what was removed. They didn't need to. They felt that this was going to work either way. Sensing a hit, Warner paid $4 million to the Wachowskis to complete the film on time to hit theaters in the spring, months ahead of The Phantom Menace. They were worried about having competition with The Phantom Menace once it came out. So they wanted to make sure that they had enough lead time to get a full run. The soundtrack includes a lot of music that the Wachowskis listened to as they constructed their script: Marilyn Manson, Prodigy, Rage Against the Machine, and all of that. In promoting the film, the reclusive Wachowskis, though, they did have a contract with Warner that included a no press clause. They decided to grant a few very limited interviews, and after which they headed back to Chicago. They did put a lot of effort into this website called whatisthematrix.com, which generated a lot of very excellent buzz, because, you know, people who are attracted to this premise obviously are people who are attracted to the virtual reality world that is, you know, your online world. Comics were written by the Wachowskis and then drawn by Jeff Darrow to supplement the film that was put on the website. Matrix Comics, they felt, could continue the story if the film proved unsuccessful, but the film obviously proved to be a massive success. Debuted at #1 at the U.S. box office for Easter weekend, Easter being very appropriate given there's a lot of Christ allusions, I guess, to Neo's character in this film. Had very long legs at the box office as well. It stuck around in the top 10 for 3 months, and it amassed $171 million in its initial run in the U.S. and then $463 million worldwide. Obviously, you know, The Matrix is one of the most influential movies of the 90s, one of the most influential, definitely sci-fi action films ever made, and it can't be overstated, its influence. I mean, if you look at the works of Christopher Nolan, especially, he cites readily The Matrix is basically the inspiration for him being able to mix action films with philosophy, and he does that in pretty much all of his films. So undoubtedly, The Matrix is a brilliantly conceived, it's extremely memorable science fiction action powerhouse. Maybe people watching it today who had never seen it before may not quite get how groundbreaking it is, because it has been so copied by almost every film that came after it within certain genres that it just kind of diluted, I think, its original vision. Even the sequels had a hard time living up to the original for those reasons, but I'll get into those obviously on future episodes. But the thing to commend here for The Matrix as it came out is that the Wachowskis really avoided going for a lot of the safe and secure action. They crafted this, what would become an international phenomenon once it was all through. Maybe not all of the concepts are wholly original. I mean, they borrowed a lot of illusions from a lot of different things. And there's a lot of people who claim that they came up with the original idea for The Matrix. You know, I could name at least a half dozen people that say that The Matrix was basically a ripoff of their property. But I'm not going to get into that, of which I have no proof. The unique blend of multitudinous genres here, though, I think is where the Wachowskis find their calling. The 90s were full of films and filmmakers that just were known for kind of digesting things that were very popular maybe and had become unpopular over time, and then putting it into a story and making something completely new out of it. You can look at Quentin Tarantino for that as well. They were almost like DJs who kind of took bits and pieces of things that they liked and made a new song out of it. But here, new films, of course. Cinematically, the look and the tempo of the action is where the Wachowskis do break new ground. There's an arresting style throughout The Matrix that achieves really exhilarating results. I think deservedly it won all 4 of the Oscars for which it was nominated: film sound, film editing, sound editing, and visual effects. For most of the film, I think that The Matrix has impeccable timing, terrific storytelling elements, an endlessly fascinating concept that is richly fleshed out as the tale unfolds. It's a superb science fiction action film with marvelous special effects for its time, conceptual mastery that really shows that concentrating more on your screenplay than you are on your special effects is going to achieve great results in the end. And it's about as ambitious an action flick as there had been in cinema for its era. So you have to really credit the Wachowskis for achieving their vision in such a masterful fashion. So, of course, what else am I going to give The Matrix but 4 stars? 4 stars out of 4 on my scale means that I think that this is a film recommended for everyone. I think even if you are not necessarily a science fiction or action lover, you still will find enough within The Matrix to find it absolutely worthwhile on multiple levels. I can't say the same for the sequels, but I've only seen the sequels once. So I'm going to be revisiting those, and because of the research I do, maybe I will come out with a different conclusion, understanding it in a more different fashion. But we'll get into those on the next episode, starting with 2003's The Matrix Reloaded. So check that out. If you haven't subscribed to the show, I do recommend subscribing it, and because we're going to be discussing all of the Matrix films going forward, including the Animatrix, by the way. If you have your own thoughts on The Matrix that you want to tell me about, you can find my contact information at my website. That's at quipster.net, QWIPSTER.net. Links to my X feed or Twitter feed or whatever you want to call it are there too, as well as my Instagram and my Facebook. So check it all out. All of the details are at quipster.net. So until you hear me again, thank you for joining me as we continue our journey to the 90s and beyond.